Good morning, everyone. It is October 21st, and I want to talk about the strategic petroleum reserves because we've seen a lot of back and forth discussion as to the pros and cons of Biden releasing 15 million barrels of oil. Obviously, this was in response to OPEC, Saudi Arabia, Russia saying they're going to cut oil production in order to drive prices up. This is to elicit angst amongst the populations of countries that are supporting Ukraine, therefore potential administration changes or policy changes in order to maintain a standard of living, at least on the energy front, in countries like the United Kingdom, Germany, the United States, etc. So they're using energy as a geostrategic playing card to try and elicit a positive response for Russia. So President Biden responded to that. Some people say that in the US are saying that it was inappropriate for Biden to release 15 million barrels because the reserves, the strategic petroleum reserves, are for national defense and not to maintain prices. Well, in my opinion, they're actually incorrect in that regard. It's called the strategic petroleum reserve because it's used for strategic reason. It's not called the military or defense petroleum reserves. There is a broader scope for these reserves than just using them for defense. Now, something about the strategic reserves. The U.S. is one of the only countries in the world that separates its government-owned strategic petroleum reserves from its commercial petroleum reserves. And that makes a huge difference when comparing it to other countries. At the current level, the strategic petroleum reserve in the US has about 400 million barrels. That's the largest of any country in the world. It is presumed that China would be second, with the second largest strategic reserves in the world. And it's believed they have somewhere around 200 million barrels currently, but China doesn't officially report that volume. The Russians don't maintain a significant reserve because they produce so much that they don't necessarily need to. So the U.S. has a significant volume of petroleum reserves. Interesting kind of fun fact, side note, these reserves in the U.S. are also protected from attack as they're not stored in tanks like you see just scattered around the country. They're actually stored in huge underground salt caverns at 4 sites along the coastline of the Gulf of Mexico. This is where I take a moment to point out to everyone, the Americans aren't as dumb as many in the world think they are. That's pretty ingenious. They're protected from attack, they're well secured, and they sit in salt caverns rather than just tanks all over the country. Very fascinating. But the U.S. separates itself in a few ways. From Russia, it separates itself from having more in reserve available immediately for emergency and wartime efforts. And from China, it separates itself by having production. Now, the U.S. wouldn't rely solely on its own strategic petroleum reserves. First and foremost, the U.S. would purchase reserves from U.S. companies, which incidentally hold roughly 500 million barrels themselves. So counting both the commercial and strategic petroleum reserves, the U.S. on its ground has somewhere between 900 million and a billion barrels of oil in reserve for use, stored. The U.S. is also the largest producer of oil, and this is where they outmatch China. The U.S. produces roughly 11 million barrels per day. In a wartime effort, that production would continue unless it's destroyed, but I've pointed out in previous videos, it's incredibly difficult to attack the U.S. mainland in any capacity. On top of that, the U.S. exports 8.5 million barrels of oil per day, of which would stop probably. If the U.S. went to a major conflict and needed its oil, it likely would tell its partners, we can no longer supply you, we need it for ourselves. However, on top of that, there is about 8.5 million barrels per day imported into the U.S., and those could continue. Now, they could pick up the slack for other areas, but also the U.S., when it comes to places like Canada and Mexico, could rely on them. And that likely would happen. Canada shares such a huge border that any defense implications for the U.S. clearly affect Canada, and they have 4.5 million barrels of production per day as well. So Canada would likely support the U.S. as its main security partner. Now, between the U.S. and Canada, and then you throw in Mexico, the total oil industry of North America can maintain itself as a self-contained energy-producing entity for years. And we know that it wouldn't take many years for the U.S. to decisively defeat China or Russia in a manner that would secure U.S. interests. Rand Corporation even said that the U.S. potentially has enough shale oil stores to last 400 years. I've heard everything from 50 years to 100 years, all the way up to this 400-year number. So that's a significant amount of oil that the U.S. is sitting on. Naysayers will say things, well, shale oil isn't an emergency reserve. And they're right. We would still have to pump it and refine it. But with 900 million barrels of immediately accessible commercial and strategic reserves, by the time that runs out, our shale oil capacity could be retooled to support a military effort. I wouldn't say more barrels are being produced, but it would be able to focus on maintaining a war effort, and we could maintain that war effort for significantly longer than any country on earth. And this is where people make a mistake, where they think the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is the end all, and they don't account for the total reserves and total production of the U.S. So the original intent of the reserves was to counter embargoes from OPEC nations. When the U.S. was largely an importer of Middle Eastern oil, we did rely on the Middle East until the shale revolution. Now, OPEC currently only makes up about 5% of U.S. oil, so embargoes are no longer a concern for the U.S. They're not a problem. So our strategic use of these reserves can shift a bit. They can be shifted to serve a better purpose. And they currently are being used in a geostrategic way to counter countries that pose a threat to the U.S. and our allies, such as Russia right now. Russia is using energy as a weapon against our allies in Europe, and by the U.S. releasing strategic reserves as a supply mechanism to the market to drive prices downwards, it counters these price rises. This means Russia doesn't generate as much oil revenue, which they in turn use to fund their war effort. It is obviously a political move also, and you can't ignore that. Many far-right Republicans clearly don't support Ukraine. From a geostrategic standpoint, Ukraine and those in Europe are supporting Ukraine would like to see the U.S. to continue to support them. The U.S. is the largest supporter by far of Ukraine in a financial and equipment sense. If many of these far-right Republicans take away that support, Ukraine loses a very powerful ally. And I and others, including General Hodges and others, believe that such a loss would strengthen Russia, which means that it weakens the U.S. Security against Russia. Now, I say far right because the moderate and kind of middle right continue to want to support Ukraine. Mitch McConnell said today a Republican majority in the Senate will focus its oversight on ensuring timely delivery of needed weapons and greater allied assistance to Ukraine. However, House GOP leader and potential Speaker of the House if the Republicans win the House, Kevin McCarthy, is seeking to slow down or even cease aid to Ukraine. Now, I see and Biden sees that as a geostrategic threat for Ukraine and therefore a geostrategic threat to Europe, which therefore means it's a threat to the U.S. because our allies are something we stand up for and protect. The U.S. is the keystone of a strong NATO. And of course, 75% of Americans support Ukraine. 75% or more of Congress does as well. But the strategic implications of a sweeping Republican-driven U.S. isolation policy has the potential to undermine the goals of the current U.S. administration in containing Russia. Biden sees winning the election as critical to maintaining a counter-Putin stance. Far-right Republicans have been absolutely open in their support of Putin, including their national media pundits. So when the economy drives votes, votes drive decisions, and decisions drive defense policy and statecraft, and that defense policy and statecraft drive whether Russia succeeds or fails. It becomes necessary to take into account administration changes in the general grand strategy of success in Russia. So President Biden used the Strategic Petroleum Reserve as it was designed in order to stop oil from being used as a weapon. In this case, it is being used to put pressure on the West to allow Russia to attack and take Ukraine. That is what Russia wants, and they're using energy for that. At its core level, he's using strategic petroleum reserves for what it was designed to do, to counter a strategy from our geostrategic and geopolitical foe. Any other argument is purely partisan, which I've talked about. But I agree with the release, and anything to stop Russia is clearly necessary.